Yun nawin dan sat tain tema, dunglaruvitong orivivia ten tena, dumarubia tenna, dumit sok, Fran Tron ter, Martin, Derek, Paul, Phil, Gary, Tom, Craig, Spencer, Howard, Nathan, Cole, Vincent, Rebecca, Sandra, Howard, Nathan, Cole, Vincent, Rebecca, Sandra, Rendon, Felix, Claudia, Cassandra, Luwinta, Warren, Yara, Weston, Hirogo, Linda, Warren, Jasper, Meredith, Catherine Ray, Owen Schraft, Cooper, Callie, Henderson, Marcus, Dominic, Gerald, Nora, Dwight, Kellerman, Kowalski, Trent, Reginald, Hal, Brent, Callaway, Fitch, Theo, Rhett, Alden, Sylvia, Walter, Everett, Stanton, Lowell, Priya, Vic Russo, Kevin, Amber, Patty, Roland, Pierce, Lorraine, Diane, Aldrich, Preston, Tim Ha, Isuidung, Miles, Nanfan Du Phone, Chin, Sutton, Suidung, Tutton Suba Tramatheary, CEO, Whitfield, Anachanizic, CEO, Whitfield, Anachana, Anhakanaksep, Jerome, Contri, Eli, Von Ha, Anha, Mohort, Antakana, Davenport, Maintenance Guy Ricky. The fluorescent lights in my director's office were still on when I drove out of the Meridian Dynamics parking lot that Tuesday evening. I could see them from the road. My office technically, though after what had just happened inside it, I wasn't sure how much longer I could call it that. I'd been sitting across from my new department head for 40 minutes. His name was Sutton, 31 years old, fresh from a consulting firm in Chicago, and he'd been at Meridian exactly 7 months. 7 months. I'd been there 16 years. He slid a printed document across his glass desk like he was returning something I'd borrowed and never properly appreciated. It was my application for VP of Operations. I'd submitted it 3 weeks earlier, right after the announcement that Richard Joe was stepping down. Richard had mentored me for 6 years. He'd told me privately that he'd already recommended me to the board. I'd gone home that night and told my son that things were finally going to change for us. Sutton said, "I want to be transparent with you, Miles." He said it the way people say things when they've already decided and just need the other person to sit still and absorb it. The board feels this transition is an opportunity to bring in some fresh leadership energy, someone who can bridge operations with modern data-driven strategy. He paused. "We're going to look externally." I asked him to be specific about what I was lacking. He said something about executive presence and stakeholder communication at the C-suite level. I'd spent the better part of last year presenting quarterly metrics directly to our largest government client. I'd flown to Washington twice on my own time, but I sat there and listened, the way my father taught me to absorb bad news. Quietly, completely, until you've heard every word and can decide what to do with it. My name is Miles Garrett. I'm 53 years old. I came to Meridian Dynamics straight out of my second stint as a field contractor for the Army Corps of Engineers, where I'd spent 11 years managing infrastructure projects in places most people can't find on a map. I know what it means to build systems that can't fail. Water treatment in rural Georgia after a hurricane. Bridge load assessments in floodplains. When you're the guy making sure the calculations are right and the wrong number means people get hurt, you develop a relationship with precision that never really leaves you. My wife Ann passed away 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer 7 months from diagnosis to the end. Our son Eli was 14, and I remember thinking in the hospital parking lot on the last night that I needed to be completely steady for him, the way a structure is steady not because nothing is pressing against it, but because the foundation was built right. I went back to work 2 weeks after her funeral because Eli needed routine. He needed to see me functional. He needed college in 4 years, and I needed to make sure the money was there. The VP position would have changed everything. A $45,000 salary increase. Full tuition reimbursement benefit for dependents. Eli had been accepted to Georgia Tech's engineering program. He was going, regardless. But the difference between him graduating debt-free and him starting his adult life with $80,000 hanging over his head was, in part, sitting on Sutton's glass desk in a folder he'd barely opened. I drove home that night without calling anyone. Eli was at his friend's house. I sat at the kitchen table where Ann used to grade her students' papers, and I thought about what I'd actually been doing for 16 years at Meridian. I'd built the operational framework for the Davenport contract from scratch. Colonel Davenport ran procurement for the Army's Eastern Logistics Division, and he was the kind of man who made decisions based on reliability. Not presentations, not dashboards, actual reliability. When Meridian's previous operations team failed an audit in 2014, I was the one who flew to Fort Meade and personally walked Davenport's team through a corrective action plan. He'd called my direct line ever since. Not the main office. My line. I'd written the emergency response protocols that were now printed in binders and distributed to every department head. I'd renegotiated our supplier contracts twice in 5 years, saving the company approximately $2.1 million in materials costs. I had a file on my computer with every decision I'd made and its outcome, because I'd always assumed someday someone would ask, and I wanted to be ready. Nobody had ever asked. The morning after the meeting with Sutton, I arrived at exactly 8 o'clock. Not 7:15, not 7:30, which had been my habit for over a decade. Arriving early to review overnight reports, check for supply chain flags, answer the emails from the overnight team that nobody else would touch until 9. At 8 o'clock, I badged in, poured coffee, and sat down at my desk. I read only the emails addressed directly to me. There were 17 others in my inbox that weren't. Questions forwarded from junior coordinators, status requests from vendors who'd learned to route through me because I actually responded, a flagged quality report from our secondary facility in Savannah that someone had CC'd me on. I looked at each one and moved it to a folder labeled Reference. My job description, as written in my employment contract, was Director of Operational Compliance. I pulled up that document and read it carefully. 14 specific responsibilities. I would handle those 14 things, nothing more. Around 10:30, my phone rang. It was Jerome, our senior production coordinator who'd been with Meridian almost as long as I had. He was one of those guys who understood everything about how a floor actually runs, the kind of institutional knowledge that doesn't show up on any org chart. "Miles," he said, and his voice had that careful flatness that meant something had gone sideways. The automated scheduling system pushed a bad update overnight. The Savannah floor assignments are all wrong for tomorrow's shift. 43 workers showing up for jobs they're not certified for. He waited. "You see that flag?" I had seen it. I'd moved it to the reference folder. "Jerome," I said, "that system falls under IT operations, which reports to the new infrastructure manager. I'd start there." There was a pause that felt longer than it probably was. "You always handle the scheduling conflicts when they cross facilities," he said. "I've been advised to concentrate on my assigned compliance functions," I said. "It's in everyone's interest that I understand my scope clearly." He was quiet for another moment. "Everything okay with you?" "Everything's fine," I said. "Just working cleanly." He hung up and I went back to a compliance audit I'd been putting off for 2 weeks because I'd been too busy handling things that technically belonged to someone else. By 2 in the afternoon, the IT infrastructure manager, a guy named Ricky who was perfectly competent with network systems but had never touched a workforce scheduling platform, had escalated the Savannah situation to Sutton's office. I could see the emails arriving in CC. They were using language like critical and potential labor violation and client impact. The Davenport delivery scheduled for that Friday ran through the Savannah floor. At 4:58, I shut down my computer, put on my jacket, and walked out. My phone was ringing before I reached my car. I turned it to silent. Eli was home when I got there. He was at the kitchen table with his laptop and a bowl of cereal, which was his standard study setup. He looked up when I walked in at 5:20, the earliest I'd been home on a weekday in years. "You're home," he said, like he was identifying something unusual in the yard. "I am," I said. He closed his laptop slightly. "Good day or bad day?" I put my keys on the counter and thought about how to answer that. "Clarifying," I finally said. He opened his laptop again but kept watching me out of the corner of his eye the way he'd done since he was small, always tracking, always trying to understand what was actually happening. Anne used to say he got that from me. I used to say he got it from her. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, the way most true things are. "Dad," he said after a few minutes, "did you eat anything today?" I had not. We ordered pizza and watched the Braves game, and I didn't check my phone once. When I finally looked at it before bed, there were 29 missed calls from various Meridian numbers. 3 from Sutton's direct line. 1 from the main executive office, which almost never called anyone's personal cell. I set the phone face down on the nightstand and slept better than I had in months. The next morning I arrived at 8 o'clock again. The lobby had a different energy, the kind of tightness in the air that happens when a building has been operating in crisis mode through the night and the people who caused the crisis have gone home and slept fine. Jerome was waiting near the elevator. His coveralls had a coffee stain on the sleeve and his eyes looked like he hadn't slept. "Savannah's a mess," he said, falling into step beside me. Ricky tried to manually override the scheduling system at midnight and made it worse. 18 workers showed up this morning for the wrong stations. OSHA regs say we can't put them on equipment they're not certified for. "That's a significant problem," I said. "Miles." He stopped walking. "The Davenport delivery is Friday, 3 days. "I know when it is," I said. "I've known about that delivery for 4 months. He stared at me. "So you'll handle it?" "I have a third-party compliance audit due to the Federal Contracting Office by end of business today," I said. "It's been on the schedule for 6 weeks. I'm going to make sure that gets done correctly." Jerome looked at me for a long moment. He wasn't angry. He was reading me, the way a man reads a situation when he's trying to understand something that doesn't quite fit the pattern he expects. Then he nodded slowly and walked away. At 11, Sutton appeared at my office door. He looked like a man who had aged slightly since the last time I'd seen him, which had been 2 days ago. His shirt was pressed, but there were signs around his eyes that suggested the pressing had been optimistic. "The Savannah scheduling crisis," he said. "Ricky says the override corrupted 2 weeks of floor assignments. Nobody can reconstruct the original logic." "I documented the original logic when I built the system," I said. "It's in the Operational Procedures Manual, Chapter 9. Workforce Scheduling Protocols. There's a flow chart." He stared at me. "Can you just fix it? I have a compliance submission due at 5 o'clock today for the Federal Contracting Office," I said pleasantly. "If I miss that deadline, Meridian risks losing its certified contractor status for the next procurement cycle. That affects approximately $6.8 million in upcoming bids." The color shifted in his face in a way that reminded me of barometric pressure dropping before a storm. "This can't wait," he said. "I completely agree," I said, "which is why I'm finishing the compliance audit." He left without answering. 20 minutes later, I heard him down the hall trying to explain to someone on the phone what a workforce scheduling logic flowchart was and why he couldn't find Chapter 9. I finished the compliance audit at 4:47 and submitted it with 13 minutes to spare. At 5 o'clock, I left. The calls that night were worse. 38 of them. A voicemail from Jerome, who sounded tired and a little desperate, explaining that Davenport, had called asking about Friday's delivery status. A voicemail from Sutton that started professionally and ended with something close to pleading. And one from a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be Meridian's chief operating officer, a woman named Hargrove who I'd met exactly twice in 16 years at company-wide meetings. I called Eli into the kitchen and asked him about Georgia Tech's orientation schedule. We talked for an hour. He told me about a professor whose research he'd read, something about structural load distribution in sustainable materials, and would have asked 12 follow-up questions. I asked for and listened carefully to the answers. At 9 o'clock, he said, "Dad, your phone has been going off like crazy." "I know," I said. "Are you going to deal with it?" "In the morning," I said. He looked at me the way Anne used to look at me when she knew I was handling something but didn't know what yet. "Okay," he said. He got up and squeezed my shoulder on his way to his room, the way he'd started doing after Anne died. This brief, solid contact that meant something neither of us had ever put into words. I didn't sleep quite as well that night. Not because I was worried. Because I was thinking. The third morning, I arrived at 8 o'clock to what could only be described as a building that had been holding its breath. The Savannah floor was running at reduced capacity. The Davenport delivery had been flagged internally as at risk. And according to Jerome, who was waiting for me again at the elevator, someone from the COO's office had been calling his cell since 7 asking him where I was. I told him I'd been home sleeping, which was my right under my employment contract during non-business hours. Jerome almost smiled at that. Almost. At 9:15, Sutton came to my office again, and this time he wasn't alone. Hargrove, the COO, was with him. She was a compact, precise woman in her 60s, who I had always suspected was the actual reason Meridian functioned, as well as it did at the executive level. She looked at Sutton once, a short, flat look, and then she looked at me. "Miles," she said, "I'd like to speak with you privately." Sutton stayed in the hall. She sat down across from me and folded her hands on my desk in a way that suggested she was comfortable with silence and wasn't going to fill it unnecessarily. "I've been going through the operational records for the last 16 years, she said. "I should have done that before approving the VP search timeline." I waited. "The Davenport relationship, you built that?" "Yes," I said. "The 2019 supplier renegotiation, the emergency response framework, the federal compliance system that just saved us from a very uncomfortable conversation with a contracting officer this afternoon." She paused. "You?" "Yes," I said again. She studied me for a moment. "I want to understand what happened in Sutton's office on Tuesday." I told her. I was precise about it. Not emotional, not dramatic. Just the facts of the conversation, including the phrase executive presence and what I had and hadn't been given as a reason. She was quiet for a moment after that. "Are you looking at other opportunities?" she asked. "I've had a conversation with Langford Infrastructure Group," I said. It was true. An old colleague had reached out 6 weeks ago and I'd had one phone call, which I'd largely put out of my mind. But it had happened. "They've indicated interest in a senior director role." Hargrove nodded slowly. "What would it take to keep you here?" "Recognition of what I've actually built," I said. "Compensation that reflects the value I represent to this company, not just what my job title has historically paid. And the authority to implement improvements instead of just maintaining things other people break." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I'm creating a VP-level position. Vice President of Operations and Infrastructure. It reports directly to me. Base salary of $175,000. Performance bonus structure and full authority over the operational divisions you've been managing informally for years." She looked at me steadily. "The tuition benefit extends to dependents at full coverage." I heard the number. I heard the tuition benefit. I kept my expression neutral, the way my father taught me, the way 16 years of being the steadiest person in any room had reinforced. "I need to think about it," I said. She nodded like she'd expected that. "Take until Monday. But before you do, I need you to stabilize the Savannah situation and make sure the Davenport delivery happens Friday. Not for Sutton, for the 214 people who work on that floor. That landed the way she intended it to. I'll handle Davenport personally," I said. "I'll have Savannah running correctly by tomorrow morning." I spent the rest of Thursday afternoon doing in 4 hours what the entire IT team hadn't been able to do in 2 days. The scheduling logic wasn't complicated if you understood why it had been built the way it was, and I'd built it, so I understood it completely. By 6 o'clock, the floor assignments were corrected, the certification flags were cleared, and I'd sent Davenport's team a direct email confirming Friday's delivery was on track. Colonel Davenport called me personally at 6:45. "Garrett," he said, "I don't know what's been happening over there this week, but I'm glad you're still answering." "Everything's on track, sir," I said. "Delivery confirmed for 0900 Friday." "Good man," he said. "Your company's lucky to have you." I got home at 7:15. Ely was in the kitchen heating up leftover pasta, and he turned around when I came in and took one look at my face. "You fixed it," he said. "Most of it," I said. He handed me a bowl of pasta and we sat down at the kitchen table. "There's an offer," I said. "A real one this time." He was quiet for a moment, turning his fork in the pasta. "What's the catch?" "No catch," I said. "The question is whether I trust it." He thought about that with the particular seriousness he'd developed over the past few years, the kind that made him seem older than 19. "Do you trust the person making it?" I thought about Hargrove's folded hands and the way she'd said 214 people. "Yeah," I said. "I think I do." "Then take it," he said. "But make them put everything in writing." Anne's son. Absolutely Anne's son. Friday morning I arrived at 7. My choice, not habit. There's a difference, and I felt it. I went to Hargrove's office before she'd finished her first cup of coffee and told her I'd accept the offer under one condition. She raised an eyebrow. "Sutton keeps his job," I said. "Not because I'm feeling generous, because replacing him doesn't fix the structural problem. This company has been relying on individual people carrying invisible weight for years, and that only changes with deliberate design, not personnel reshuffling." She looked at me for a moment that stretched comfortably. the way silences do between people who both think carefully before speaking. That's an unusual condition, she said. I'm an unusual person to have put up with things this long, I said. She smiled. A small real one. The offer letter will be ready by end of day. The Davenport delivery went out at 9 o'clock without a single incident. I stood on the loading dock and watched the trucks pull out and thought about the 11 years I'd spent with the Army Corps. The calculations that couldn't be wrong, the structures that had to hold. I thought about Anne sitting at the kitchen table at 11 at night, grading papers with a cup of tea she always let go cold. I thought about Eli in his first semester at Georgia Tech, learning about load distribution in sustainable materials, not owing anyone $1. Jerome found me on the dock. You're staying, he said. It wasn't a question. I'm staying, I said. He nodded. He looked like a man who had been awake for 3 days and was only now beginning to believe he might sleep. For what it's worth, he said, I figured it out around day 2, what you were doing. I figured you might, I said. Did it work? I looked out at the parking lot where the last truck was pulling onto the road. Ask me in 6 months, I said. 6 months later, the Davenport contract had expanded by 30%. Jerome had been formally promoted to Senior Operations Coordinator, a title that finally matched what he'd been doing for years. We'd built a structured advancement program for the operational staff with clear benchmarks and actual salary progression tied to them, not to how well you hid your value or how visible your face was in the right meetings. I left at 5 o'clock every Friday, no exceptions. Sutton and I developed a working relationship that I'd describe as professional and occasionally even functional. He was better at the strategic presentation layer than he'd ever be at operations, and once he stopped pretending otherwise, he became genuinely useful in the role he actually belonged in. One evening, about 8 months in, Eli called me from his dorm. He'd gotten a research position with the professor he'd told me about. He sounded the way Anne used to sound when something she'd worked for had finally arrived. That particular quality of happiness that has effort underneath it. Dad, he said, I think I'm gonna like it here. I know you are, I said. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a while. The table was the same one where Anne had graded papers, where Eli had worked on his college applications, where I'd sat alone the night Sutton told me I lacked executive presence. I thought about what executive presence actually meant. I'd decided it meant this: being the person in the room whose absence changes everything. Not the loudest voice, not the best dressed one. The one whose work is the foundation that everyone else stands on, whether they know it or not. The difference is that now, finally, they know it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do when someone underestimates you isn't to prove them wrong loudly. It's to become impossible to ignore quietly. And then, once you have what you've earned, build a world where the next person doesn't have to wait as long as you did to get it. I've thought a lot about those 3 days. Not with pride exactly. More like the feeling you get when you finally stop carrying something heavy you'd convinced yourself was normal. For 16 years I showed up early, stayed late, and solved problems that weren't technically mine to solve. I told myself it was professionalism, that it was what good people did. And maybe some of it was. But some of it was also fear. Fear that if I stopped being indispensable in the invisible way, someone would notice I'd never been properly valued in the visible one. So I kept filling the gap. Every day I covered for a system that was broken and called it dedication. What Sutton said to me wasn't just insulting, it was clarifying. Executive presence. He meant I wasn't loud enough, visible enough, political enough. He meant I didn't look like the version of leadership he'd been trained to recognize. And the thing is, he wasn't entirely wrong about what he was measuring. He just had no idea what he was missing. There's a kind of courage that doesn't look like courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. Eli never asked me why I started coming home for dinner. He just noticed, and he was glad. That matters to me more than I know how to say. Anne spent years telling me that the work I did at the kitchen table after midnight wasn't the work that would matter most when I was old. I understood what she meant intellectually. It took losing her and then nearly losing myself inside a job that didn't see me to understand it in my bones. What I did those 3 days wasn't sabotage. I want to be clear about that. I didn't break anything. I simply stopped propping up what was already broken. The scheduling system failed because it had been built on one person quietly catching every error before it became visible. The Davenport situation escalated because the institutional knowledge that prevented it had never been documented in anyone's job description. I let the reality become visible. That's all. The cause and effect of it is actually simple once you see it. When you absorb consequences for an organization that isn't designed to function without you, you give that organization permission to stay broken. You become the patch on a pipe that should have been replaced years ago. The pipe doesn't learn to hold pressure just because you keep your hand on it. It just leaks somewhere else when you're not looking. What I asked of Hargrove when I accepted wasn't revenge. Keeping Sutton wasn't generosity either, if I'm honest. It was accuracy. He was bad at operations because he'd never been asked to be accountable for them. Put him where he actually belonged, and he became useful. That's not a character transformation. That's just alignment. What I carry from all of it is this. The measure of your worth isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what stops working when you don't. And if you've been carrying something invisible for years and no one has noticed, that's not humility on your part anymore. That's a system that has learned it doesn't have to pay for what it's been given for free. Know what you're worth. Document it. And when someone tells you you're not ready, decide very carefully what you're going to do next. Eli was right. Put it in writing.